Welcome to session 10 of Data Network Security 1. Today we'll be looking at cross-site request forgery. At the end of this session, you should be able to explain what cross-site request forgery is and even know the difference between this and cross-site scripting. You should be able to tell us the different types of vulnerabilities that fall into this category and ways to prevent this form of attack. We'll also exploit cross-site request forgery in the autoromutual.com. Now, what is cross-site scripting? Now, cross-site request forgery tricks the user or tricks the victim into sending an unknown or unknowing request to another site, normally using your session ID or network access. Now, here the browser is tricked into sending this request to a different web application. Now, this is done blindly but with the victim's information or cookies from a victim's machine. So it means that an attacker is able to hack your machine or is able to attack your machine and sends information on your behalf, which you did not initiate. Now, web application trust requests coming from this victim. So once it is initiated, it's presumed to be authentic. Now, what are the implications with cross-site request forgery? Here we have internal network. Your internal network is compromised. And moreover, your web-based accounts are exploited. What is the security risk? Now, cross-site request forgery attacks that allow the hacker to perform actions on the vulnerable site, and this is done on behalf of the victim. The attack is possible when the vulnerable site does not properly validate the origin of the request. So basically, you don't authenticate where the request is coming from. One just accepts or clicks on some links or some websites. Now, the severity of this vulnerability depends on the functionality of the affected application. Now, for example, if it's just on a normal page, search page, then it's not that severe. But assuming it happens on a money transfer or profile update page, then that becomes serious. Now, the attack is basically performed by forcing the victim's browser. So here, your browser is forced to issue an HTTP request to this vulnerable site. Now, if the user is currently logged in, which we'll see an example, to the victim site, the request will automatically give access to your site because it will use your user credentials, which we've already been talking about, your session cookies, session ID, user's IP address, and other browser authentication methods. Now, using this, the attacker forges the victim's identity like an impersonation and submits actions on his or her behalf. How do we determine if one is vulnerable to cross-site request forgery? Now, first check if any link or form lacks an unpredictable cross-site request forgery token. Now, this is the key. Once the token is there, then your site is secured. But without such a token, attackers can forge malicious requests. Now, an alternative defense is to require the user to prove they intend to submit the request. So, for instance, with the banking system, for example, once you are transferring some amount of money or doing online transaction, you are called to verify your account before such monies are being processed. That is one form of checking cross-site request forgery. Now, some sites also make you fill some forms. For example, what is called a CAPTCHA, CAPTCHA. Now, once you fill that, some people say that is to determine whether you are a robot or a human being. But that's one form of checking cross-site request forgery. Now, focus on links and forms that invoke state-changing functions. So links that requires you to change your password, requires you to change your account, provide your account. Such forms need to be reconsidered carefully because they are targets for cross-site request forgery. Now, you should also check multi-step transactions. Now, attackers can easily forge a series of requests by using this multi-tags or multi-steps transaction. Your session cookies, session IP addresses, and other informations automatically sent by the browser don't provide any defense against cross-site request forgery. Now, since this information is also included in the forged request, because it sends that information without your knowledge, it's done unknowingly. Now, this is an example of a cross-site request forgery. Now, assume that your bank's site uses cookies to remember that you logged in. So any of the banks, maybe the site, once you logged in, they remember that, okay, these are your credentials, and they do that using your cookies. Now, if, for instance, you are supposed to transfer funds from a default account, say HTTP my bank transfer some 100 Ghana cedis. Now, also assume that you visit a blog and it has an image IMG source with the same link. Now, your browser will automatically request the link with your cookies because it has the same link and request as the one from your bank, and the funds will be transferred to the attacker's account. Now, let's look at an illustration of cross-site request forgery. So, an innocent user logs into an authenticated session, probably your bank, then requests to transfer funds. Now, the intention is to send this fund to user account 2. But we have an attacker that captures such transaction because your site was vulnerable. Let's see what happens. Now, on your next login, an attacker modifies that transaction, which was intended to send money to user 2. And once the user logs in and clicks on the phishing page, the attacker runs this transaction. And instead of the account going to user 2, we see that the account or the money goes to the attacker's account. And that's how come cross-site scripting is being implemented. Now, how do we prevent cross-site requests? Now, we can do that by eliminating cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. And don't use your site shouldn't be a source for an attacker to do a cross-site request forgery. Also, by protecting your website from becoming a victim of cross-site request forgery attacks, insert random tokens into forms and URLs used in transaction. Use only post, like we said earlier on, HTTP post methods when sending sensitive data to the web server. Now, in Microsoft ASP.NET, set a view state user key, and this provides a mechanism similar to random tokens. This is an example of inserting a random token in a form. So we have one for the HTML and we have one for URL. You can see the token for the UT. For the HTML, we have name with a number, then value with a number. Now in the URL, we kind of compare these two fields, and that's how random token is inserted into a form. You get to do more of this in the hands-on lab in Sakai. Now, also include an unpredicted or unpredictable token in each HTTP request. These tokens will be unique per session. Now, the unique tokens can also be included in the URL itself or a URL parameter. Now, requiring the user to re-authenticate or prove they are a user can also protect against cross-site request forgery. Another way of doing or preventing cross-site request forgery is what is known as the link injection, and this facilitates cross-site request forgery. Now, link injection is an exploit that can assist in conducting cross-site request forgery, and this is formulating using the cross-site scripting weakness. Now, once that is exploited, link injection becomes vulnerable to cross-site request forgery. Now, this link injection is a modifying of the content of the site by embedding in it a URL to an external site or to a script in the vulnerable site. Some of these possible attacks require the user to be logged in to the site during the attack. So once the user is logged in, that is when the attacker is able to do all the authentication on behalf of the user. Now, by launching these attacks from the vulnerable site itself, the attacker increases the chance of success. Now, the resulting ability of inject hazardous characters into the response makes it possible for attackers to embed URLs among other possible content modification. So this is an example of link injection. Now, this example exploits a cross-site scripting weakness, and we've already spoken about cross-site scripting. So we see some URLs here, and the test response contains a link to the file www.ibm.com, and this link could invoke a fraudulent transaction. We see that in the image, and once that is clicked, it sends different messages to the attacker. How do we prevent link injection? Now, preventing link injection like cross-site scripting requires separation of untrusted data from active browser content. Now, the preferred option is to properly escape all untrusted data based on the HTML content. So we are talking about the body, the attributes, JavaScript, CSS, or the URL. All input points should protect against invalid input. Now, visit Sakai and do the labs in Lab 8. This will help you to exploit cross-site scripting or cross-site request forgery. Once that is done, you'll be able to have more insight on what cross-site request forgery is. So in this session, I've been speaking to you about what cross-site request forgery is. We've looked at some vulnerabilities with regards to this, and we've seen how to prevent these types of attack. This will bring us to the end of session 10. I will see you in session 11.